Does anyone else want to do the intro this time?
No.
No.
From TLDR News, this is Too Long Didn't Read. Okay, so we'll start with the Manchester story. This is the news this week that the government and the Mayor of Manchester and the Greater Manchester councils have kind of been at odds over the funding that Manchester is going to receive for going into the Tier 3 restrictions. Andy Burnham seemed to have done some number crunching and come to the figure of £90 million being needed to help businesses survive through the Tier 3 restrictions. He said that the lowest Manchester could go was £65 million. Johnson refused to give him that and offered a maximum of £60 million. There's also the other number that's been sort of touted a lot this week, which is £22 million. But it should be noted that that money is being given to improve local test and trace services and things similar to that, not to help local businesses, which is what the money Andy Burnham wanted, which is what Andy Burnham wanted the money for. So this has been sort of the back and forward, and then there was sort of a argument as to who walked away from negotiations and whose fault it is. There was a letter signed by the local MPs, I think 6 of the 9 Manchester Tory MPs signed a letter to Andy Burnham saying you were offered 60 million, which was something like 95% of the money, or something around there, that you asked for, and you turned away without, you walked away from the negotiations without accepting it. Andy Burnham disagrees, and he seems to think that it was the government that walked away. So there's been a lot of controversy around this week. What does everyone think about that? Does anybody else have any strong opinions on the money?
Josh, why don't you start? Because I think Josh had a contrarian opinion to yours there.
Just the point about the offer of money, really. I completely understand where Andy Burnham's coming from, trying to do the best for his constituents and the people he represents, because Manchester has really bad levels of child poverty. It's has some of the most deprived areas in the UK. But in terms of the government side of things, what I felt a bit weird about was the fact that obviously the government can't be seen to be giving different areas different levels of money proportionally. So I felt like whilst Andy Burnham was doing the right thing for his constituents, it came to a point where you've got to accept that the government can't just be dishing out different levels of money to different people. So, and then Liverpool Council, prior to the Manchester thing, negotiated really quickly. They got 30 million. It's run by Labour. It's a Labour city mayor. And then South Yorkshire yesterday, I think, has just got announced that he was going into Tier 3. It got 30 million. Dan Jarvis, who is the Sheffield mayor and was involved in the negotiations, insisted it was the best possible thing he could have got. And I just think it's interesting to compare how the negotiations pre and post Manchester went, because it seems like Manchester's just the outlier, and you would have thought that maybe Dan Jarvis or people going into Tier 3 after Manchester would have maybe followed Andy Burnham's lead.
Are you suggesting that Manchester got a good deal with the £60 million comparative to the other cities?
No,
or not?
As in it seems to have got the deal everyone else got proportionally, because Manchester has pretty much double, or Greater Manchester has pretty much double the population of, the South Yorkshire region, Liverpool, Merseyside. So it's what I'm saying is it got the proportionate offer, but because of Andy Burnham's negotiations and trying to get more, fair enough, he feels costing wise, he needed more. But you just would have thought that maybe South Yorkshire would have followed his lead and negotiated in the same way.
I think there's a couple of things to unpack there, though, isn't there? There's firstly the question of whether or not the government's offer was proportionate to the offers of other cities, which is something we should talk about quickly. There's secondly the point about why Dan Jarvis didn't follow Andy Burnham's example, why he didn't put up as much of a fuss. But I think that the thing that both of those are interesting questions, but I think the thing people were so sort of opposed to was obviously the way the government handled
the 5
not
million.
giving them the 5 million and the 60 million, because obviously they did U-turn. Johnson was avoided that question 5 times in his press conference. Well, for those of you who didn't watch the press conference, he was asked 5 times whether or not he was still giving the 60 million that they had originally offered Andy Burnham, that Andy Burnham had said was too little, to Manchester. And 5 times he dodged the question. And the obvious inference there is that no, the plan was that they don't get the money. And that, I think that was the thing that people took such issue with, and probably the thing that me and Ben take issue with, was the fact that is such patent politics, and fundamentally the people who suffer are the Mancunian business owners. But I think on the question of proportionality, I mean, we did the sums on that video, and it is on the lower end of the spectrum, the 60 million, and I think probably, I don't know what Andy Burnham would say, but he might want to say something along the lines of, a sort of simple per capita calculation is not sufficient. Manchester business owners have been in some sort of lockdown since the end of July. We need a bit of extra special support. And it is worth saying that, obviously per capita, it was less than Lancashire.
To be devil's advocate, someone could advocate that, yes, Manchester got less because there's more people, so they can achieve greater economies of scale.
But just to very quickly put that argument down, Nelson, economies of scale is a fair enough relevant argument between sort of different categories of populations. But as to whether or not an economy of scale argument works, the difference between 1.6 million people in Liverpool versus 2.8 in Manchester, that's a tenuous argument at best.
Yeah, I'm just being devil's advocate.
Can I just come back on the thing that you were saying, Zach, about the refusal for Johnson to say what was happening with the 60 million in the press conference, and then the following morning you turning on that. I think that and as I say, I think you've already brought this up, if not in the last podcast, certainly to me since, or at some point, that communication is definitely an issue that the government is dealing with at the minute. Like, they are really bad at communicating decisions. I think in the video you even put, or I think it was either in the video or in the podcast, you put something like I think it was Manchester, when they went into lockdown, it was announced at 9 p.m. and then it was enforced the next morning. And that's not an uncommon thing. That happens frequently. I mean, just to add on to that, there was the countries going on the red list about where you had to isolate from when you came back.
Yeah.
And they announced France is going on it, and you wouldn't know. The ministers would clearly not know when they go out and then come back, and then the next day they'll give a definitive answer. There's been a couple of times when they've been finalising coronavirus restriction rules, so just rules nationally in the past, where it's been touted that something's going to happen, like from an insider, in a Telegraph source or something like that, on like a Sunday. Then on a Monday morning there will be a cabinet meeting, and that plan will be dropped and something else will be changed. And then in the briefing on the Monday afternoon, something else will happen. It seems like the government is making really important decisions last minute, not like having a meeting with a really small number of people and leaving the people that need to know about these changes in the dark. And that's really frustrating from a planning point of view. I mean, people have to plan their way around this pandemic, and it's impossible to do so when the rules change so quickly and without any notice. And this here is another symptom of that. With the funding, and Manchester again being left in, people in Manchester being left in the dark. It's absolutely ridiculous. I don't understand how that can be defended. I'm sure, Nelson, if you've got any arguments, please let me know.
No.
I don't understand how it can be defended.
I was actually going to back you up, because something we've not mentioned yet is exactly how Andy Burnham came to know he was going to get 22 million. He was told live by reporters during his own press conference.
Yeah.
He didn't know. The reporters around him all knew first.
Yeah. And does that not just show you how bad communication is at the minute? Is that not just the perfect, example? And I should have thought of that one first, to be fair. Of all the examples I gave, that was the most obvious. But you're absolutely right. And I don't understand that. I do not understand how you can run a country with decisions made at and changed at the last minute in the way that it currently is.
100%, because you don't even have the person you're giving the money to at the table. So how are you meant to communicate that properly? It's like there's still, to this day, confusion about exactly what the 22 million is for.
Yes.
Some people are saying it is just for test and trace, but the PM had a statement in which he said there was 20 million for test and trace, and in his own words, 22 million for local response. What does local response mean?
When we say this 20 million for test and trace and whatnot, what is the actual funding for test and trace used for?
What I read I think it was maybe from Andy Burnham, was that the 22 million was for enforceability and test and trace. So whatever falls within that, possibly
the police.
Well, I was thinking COVID marshals.
It is stuff like that.
Because they announced these COVID marshals a few months ago, and they said it would be used in local areas, and I think that was the phrase they used. So I imagine it will be used to try and get some form of either police or what's it called, COVID marshals,
community protection stuff.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And then they would also use some of it to presumably increase testing there, or possibly even this new, they've been saying that this Operation Moonshot, part of that is that they've got these really quick tests that will come back within like an hour, and part of their plan for rolling them out, from what I was reading, was that they'll go into hospital settings first and then local areas with a high outbreak. So what I'm imagining is some of that money might go towards these quick tests that might be used in places like Greater Manchester to try and get them out of the restrictions. Again, that is just speculation, and I don't know how true that is, but it could be that I would argue that could fall under the remit of sort of test and trace, but who knows? I mean, has anybody else heard different?
Whatever. I just think on this whole thing, all of the negotiations, whatever side of it you're on, however you feel about what should have been done or whatever, it was just like a massive mess on both sides in terms of communication, in terms of negotiation, and I don't think it needs to be that like partisan, and when we're all trying to like come together and sort out these issues for people in tier 3, it didn't need to be like a week-long negotiation that ended like that. It was just a mess.
I mean, I know I've spoken a lot, so I'll just try and get through this one quickly. But when I was preparing for the podcast yesterday, I thought, just for sake of argument, let's have a look into some government projects that didn't go anywhere. And because at the end of the day, yes, exactly. At the end of the day, what they were arguing about was £5 million. The difference between the 60 million and the 65 million that Andy Burnham wanted. Now, here's some things that I found yesterday that the government, mainly Boris himself, has spent money on. There was £100 million for Get Ready for Brexit adverts for the 31st of October, which we didn't leave on. There was the £13.8 million contract to Seabourn Freight, which was the ferry company that had no ferries, for a no-deal Brexit. There was £79.7 million for renovation of Elizabeth's Tower, which, I mean, does need to happen, but it's still a lot of money. I mean, that's £80 million. They were asking for £60 million. Garden Bridge, which cost £53 million and never happened. £323,000 by Boris Johnson that he bought as Mayor of London, that was then ruled as illegal by Theresa May, that they couldn't use. £5.2 million for feasibility schemes for the Estuary Airport in London. So that was just ever so slightly more than what they were, the difference between what Burnham was asking for and what he was given. £305.5 million to the taxpayer to convert the Olympic Stadium for West Ham. They were paid £15 million by West Ham and a £2.5 million a year in rent. There was the Olympic Park Orbit Tower, which cost £3.1 million. And then there was the £10 billion on test and trace, with which only 1/4 of the people who tested positive were actually contacted. And £5 million is 0.05% of that cost. And then there was the David Cameron Remain leaflets, which cost £9.3 million. So just to put into perspective how little money £5 million is to government.
That was a lot of perspective.
Yeah. I want to really make clear the point that £5 million isn't that much to government. And I think hopefully that has become at least a little bit more clear on the back of those examples.
Do you not think that what I was thinking during like the negotiations, they should have just, I was thinking Andy Burnham should just go, I'll take the 60 million, and then surely there's like prospect to then negotiate up from that to either get the 5 million or more, depending on how much need there is from there. I felt like just take what you can get now and then go from there.
I think Andy Burnham obviously presumed that was what was happening.
Yeah.
Obviously Andy Burnham, I don't think any sane either party to that negotiation or observer of that negotiation would have thought the outcome which Boris Johnson originally went for and then U-turned on the next day was actually going to be the outcome.
But did he really U-turn? Because Matt Hancock, like a couple of hours after
had said it was
Andy
still
Burnham's
available.
announcement,
That
it
was the
said it was
quote.
still available.
Yeah, but the
But
quote
that
was
means like it's still available to him to take.
yeah, but I obviously that obviously wasn't it
Do you think
wasn't
that was in response to
that
public
would have been
backlash?
60 million. That's all you're getting. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it wouldn't have
Okay.
been 60 million plus an option for negotiating that further 5 million. And I just want to very quickly, because it's actually an interesting point. I had an argument with someone about it yesterday, and they said they gave this sort of like business analogy. You know, it's like, well, if you push too hard, you're going to get nothing. Yeah, and it's just worth noting how that analogy fails, because in a business analogy, if both parties walked away from negotiations, that would mean that the government wouldn't got what it wanted, so no tier 3, and Andy Burnham would have got zero money as well. Yeah. The reason that analogy obviously fails is because the government just got what it wanted and Andy Burnham got nothing. And I just think that's worth pointing out to people, and that fundamentally the discretion lies with government in these cases, because they are the ones with the primacy, the legislative primacy, to give out that money.
We should also point out that there was Tory MPs like kicking off at the government, weren't there, and representing Manchester. So it's not a fully partisan thing.
Having said that, what I did read was that the councils have to collect the money separately from government. So that £60 million is split to the individual Manchester councils, and apparently the Bolton council has broken ranks and has gone to negotiate a bespoke deal to get some of the money for themselves, whereas the others are like holding out to try and get a better deal. From what I've read,
Bolton council's Conservative, isn't it?
Yes, okay. It's a Tory-led council.
I think it just comes down to power. It comes down to who's controlling the money. Central government still wants that control over the money, and they don't want to give it up. They don't want to just give 65 million without conditions. They want conditions in place.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange because at the minute it seems like there's a big debate, as you say, Nelson, about where sort of power lies, and I think local leaders are trying to act as if the power lies with them in the coronavirus pandemic, and there's this whole sort of approach by government where it's almost like a conciliatory sort of response, where they try and negotiate with councils and to try and get presumably public opinion on side. So they'll say, we've come to an agreement with local council, you're going to go into tier 2 or tier 3 or whatever. And because a lot of this pandemic is to do with trying to get the public on side with these rules, because almost all of them are completely unenforceable. So trying to get public opinion on side is important. But this has been the first example where that just is, as you say, it's all a show. It's not it's not a conciliatory sort of approach. It's not actually power isn't equal between the two. Government can impose when it wants, and it wants to look like it's conciliatory for public opinion, to try and keep people to follow the rules. But when push comes to shove, that's not how it works, and they know that. And as Dak said about the negotiation standpoint, like, they're very aware of that. And when councils don't play ball, they're happy to flex that power.
Shall we move on then?
Yeah, let's move on. Let's just move on.
Let's move on.
PMQs?
Yeah. Yes, PMQs. Let's do PMQs. So yeah, Prime Minister's questions happened again this week. Obviously, midday Wednesday. We kind of saw like 3 main areas that were sort of discussed by Keir Starmer. The first one was to do with how do you get out of tier 3, and there was some quite interesting answers there. The second one was kind of more about like Manchester and what was going on there. Obviously, we've already spoken about that, so I won't go too much into that one. And then the third one was about circuit breaks and whether the Prime Minister supports them. I think on obviously the Manchester one we've already kind of discussed, and it's kind of what you'd expect there. Starmer said, why aren't you supporting Manchester? Johnson said, we're giving them 60 million or whatever, so that's all fine. But the other two points, the ones about how do you get out of tier 3 and circuit breaks, was all kind of all over the place. Like with how do you get out of tier 3, it was to do with if the R, Johnson came back with if the R's below 1, to which Starmer said, what if it's above 1? Can you get out of it? Johnson kind of gave a nonsensical answer, kind of didn't answer is probably a better way to put it. Didn't really answer, which kind of suggested that that's not the only way to get out of tier 3, which obviously begs the question, what are the other ways, which he didn't elaborate on or answer.
The question on how to get out of tier 3 is also related to the question of what is the point of tier 2?
Yes.
Basically, no one's in it. Like, and London's in it. There's a few, obviously, like Newcastle's in it and stuff. Like, there's a few places that are in it, but it seems to just be like you go a lot of places just went straight into tier 3, and it's quite hard to get out of tier 3
Yes.
to go.
Also, everywhere that goes
there's
to tier
not
2.
much point in going down from tier 3 to tier 2 if it's still an issue.
And that's the point. I think Starmer said that every region in the UK other than Cornwall has a higher number of cases than Manchester did when it first went into tier 2 or something. And his point is that everywhere's sort of raising up to the point of tier 2 and then to go into tier 3, and that every place, I think Zach
Everywhere
was about
should
to say,
really be in tier 2 except
yes,
places like Devon, is it, or something, that Devon
Cornwall,
has like
yeah.
no cases or whatever.
They've got they're having a weekly decrease in the number of cases. I think Cornwall. I don't know about Devon, maybe Devon as well, but Cornwall.
Because the summer's over, no one's going.
Yeah, and they're fairly isolated from the rest. Like, they're not in the central UK. It's just kind of like they're in there and there. So that was quite an interesting one. Then the last part. I mean, we can discuss that a bit more in a second, but just so I can get through sort of what actually happened. The last one was about a circuit break. Johnson seemed to... The really weird part of this was that Johnson started off by sort of ridiculing Starmer for supporting a national lockdown, and he said he wants to turn the lights off and everything, which I don't quite understand what turn the lights off mean, because if you're indoors, so the lights are going to be on more, but anyway. So he said we're going to...
That was so petty. Go on, though.
Anyway, so turn the lights on, all this. So they're having a go at Starmer, and then Starmer said, "Are you going to support a circuit break on Friday, as in tomorrow?" And he said, "We'll do whatever's necessary," which suggests he hasn't actually got a firm answer, and probably doesn't actually know himself yet. As we discussed about the Manchester thing, I think that they kind of make decisions very last minute. So quite honestly, I don't think he has an answer. But why would you start off by ridiculing him for supporting a circuit break if you don't yet yourself know whether you're going to impose a circuit break? That's just gonna, if you do impose a circuit break, that's just gonna come back to bite you.
My theory on this is that he doesn't. I feel like it's going to happen, but he can't be seen to just be like giving in to the pressure from the opposition, because that would make him look bad. And I think my theory is that he was just sort of trying to wait it out to then put in a circuit breaker when it doesn't seem like he's just responding to what Starmer said. But now that's happening, it just begs the question: is he going to do it, or is he just going to bite the bullet on like looking bad politically?
Yeah. I mean, I just don't understand. As I said about the Manchester thing, I just think it comes down to when decisions are made, and you would either, if you know that it's not going to happen on Friday, you can definitively rule that out, and you can use that to your credit and say that the leader of the opposition is trying to shut down this country. We can definitively say that we're not going to be imposing a circuit breaker anytime soon. You can use that to your defence. The only reason I can see why you wouldn't give a definitive answer on that and use that to your advantage in Prime Minister's questions is if you don't know. Now, I could be wrong, and maybe somebody disagrees with me here, but I don't understand. And why would you start off by ridiculing someone if you don't yet yourself know that you're going to use it? I don't understand that.
Well, to be fair, they are having to work, like, in these situations, you have to work day to day on your strategy. Obviously, they can be more coherent, but in terms of what you're saying about him, like, not being able to say, like, there's the very real possibility that they might be planning it and they just don't want to reveal it yet. But like, you in a crisis like this, you can't just commit to something and then.
That's absolutely fine. Fine. So don't ridicule Starmer for it then. Like if that's still on the table, don't start the whole thing off by saying the leader of the opposition wants to turn the lights out or whatever he said. Like but I do understand what you're saying about the whole, like, there is a benefit to maybe not showing your hand, especially in a situation like this, because you don't know what the week's going to bring. You don't know what's going to happen.
What happened at the start of lockdown, wasn't it? Like. Yeah. I don't know how much, the whole herd immunity thing was actually going to be their strategy, but there was so much pressure for a national lockdown that then happened, regardless of whether that was going to be what they were going to do anyway. It came on the back of a lot of pressure.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. You've been uncharacteristically quiet here, Zach. I presume you have. Do you have strong opinions on this?
I'm going to explode now.
No, I'm not.
He's going to say that everybody, from the speaker to everybody sat in that chamber, was crap. They were all awful. They were
I actually was about to say that. You actually predicted what I said perfectly, but the reason I was being quiet is because I actually completely agree with you for once. I think you hit the nail on the head. It was so disappointing week in, week out to see. Well, Johnson, and for that matter, as we saw with Angela Rayner, some of the Labour MPs hurling petty crap across the chamber. Yeah. For those of you who aren't up to date, Angela Rayner called Tory MPs scum
Deputy
in the House
leader.
of Commons.
Yeah.
Yeah, Andy Lorena, deputy
Yeah.
leader. Yeah. She's since apologised, but that's only so much. She's still called someone scum in the House of Commons.
Yeah.
And yeah, on the Johnson front, I completely agree with you. It is so tiring. It's just pathetic, and it's definitely been a trend. Like I've seen so many. I mean, we're not going to go into cases here, but I've just endlessly, my Twitter feed is full of misbehaviour in the Commons, of people responding to sincere questions with sort of pseudo patriotic trite. It's just, yeah, and so I agree with you there, and that made me slightly upset. I was also on that front. I was particularly upset about the TFL thing, which we should talk about.
Yes.
At the end of that, because that is nonsense. The TFL. So Boris Johnson's argument is that Sadiq's fare freeze. Everyone remember that? When basically he didn't make tube prices rise with, what are they supposed to rise by? Anyone know? Is it just inflation? What measure of inflation?
It's probably inflation plus a few %.
Anyway, yeah, so he didn't make TFLs, and anyway, so his argument, exactly. Do you want to explain that very quickly, Nelson?
The hopper fare is that you can, if you pay £1.50 to get on a bus, you can get into any other buses within 1 hour and pay just that single fare. You don't pay a fare for each bus you get on.
So I do actually have some stats on this. So the freeze in fares cost TFL about 640 million over 4 years. Yeah. Which is it's 150 million a year. So the drop in passenger income from COVID is 1.9 billion, which is just way and above anything that the freeze fare created. Also, it's worth noting that they're required to have cash reserves
For 2 months.
For 2 months, which was 1.2 billion quid. That was what they required. They had cash reserves of 2.2 billion quid, which is a billion extra. And on the very last thing is that they have, I think, since their inception, run a deficit. And Sadiq has, for the last 4 years, cut the deficit. So the deficit has been shrinking. They're still running a deficit, but they've been cutting it. And it's worth noting that they in, I think, 2018, they no longer got a 700 million operating grant from the government. And they now say they receive 40% less funding in real terms than they did in 2010. So, and that's from central government. So really, Sadiq Khan has done nothing in this case that you can reasonably claim to be the cause of this, of TFL's bankruptcy at the moment. Anyway, we should actually flesh that out a little bit more. Sorry, that was too slow. But yeah, so basically, the reason that this is controversial is because obviously TFL's bankruptcy is not Sadiq Khan's fault. It's just that there was a massive drop in passenger numbers, and unlike other public transport operators, which, for example, in Europe, in Italy, and France, they're far more subsidised by the state. TFL actually makes most of its money, so 70% of its income comes from ticket fares. So it really relies on people going through. Like if there's a drop in customers, that they really struggle. Anyway, it's obviously not Sadiq Khan's fault, and Boris Johnson is denying him the required money to bail out TFL and saying the only way you're going to get it is if you raise the money yourself, essentially. And they've told him how he's supposed to raise that money. So they've said stuff like extend the congestion charge to the North and South Circular, which is London lingo, but it basically means you have to pay a certain amount of money when you go into central London. It means expand out that area massively. And the reason they're doing this is because they think, and this was so explicit in PMQs, the reason they're doing this is because they're trying to decrease support for the current Labour London Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and give their candidate Sean Bailey a better chance. Sorry, that was such a long explanation, but you get the point. And it was so explicit in PMQs because he literally said, Sadiq Khan has bankrupted TFL, but luckily Sean Bailey will be back there to put its finances in order. And that was so sad to see, because you're not even covering it. You're denying London money because you want Sadiq Khan to lose. And firstly, there was no chance in hell he will lose. He currently leads Sean Bailey by at least 20 points. There's no way he's going to lose. And the Conservatives are polling that many points beneath Labour in general Westminster voting polls in London as well. But but it's so sad to see. And for those of us who live in London, it's a pain in the ass because, like, for example, Hammersmith Bridge, which...
Oh, God.
Yeah, don't even get us... Sorry, is this too niche? Is this boring?
Yeah.
Neither me nor
in
Josh live in London, so I think we're as baffled as the other people
I've
listening.
got no idea what's going on about London. I didn't know any of these things were.
Okay,
The only thing to add here would be the major condition that has annoyed a lot of people in London is that the removal of free travel from children and the over 60s. That has caused a lot of issues.
What's Hammersmith Bridge got to do with it?
Very old bridge that's about to fall down, that you can barely walk across, and there's
You're not allowed to walk across anymore. You're not allowed to walk across.
Really?
No, you're not allowed to walk across. So it's just so boring. Anyway, it's basically a bridge.
You're not rusty on Google.
I'm Googling it as well.
Yeah, it's rusting. It's made out of there's cast iron which has been cracking in it. Anyway, the point is that obviously we need a new bridge there. Because if you want to get from one side of Hammersmith Bridge to the other side of Hammersmith Bridge, like it's maybe like 100 meters tops, yeah. But to do it, you've got to walk about 5 miles in this massive U shape to take another bridge to cross it.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Putney or
Chiswick Bridge. Anyway, it's a complete disaster, and they blamed Sadiq Khan for the collapse of an 18th century bridge. They said it's his fault. He's got to pay for it, and obviously he can't pay for it because. Well, where'd you get the money to build a new bridge? Yeah. And so this is the theme, is that basically things happen that aren't Sadiq Khan's fault, and the government says, we're not giving you any money, it's all Sadiq Khan's fault. If you want money, vote in Sean Bailey, who's their candidate, which is
who presumably will then
politics.
be given the money.
He will. He'll be given a load of money.
Yeah.
This just comes back to the stupidity of excessive partisan politics, isn't it?
Yeah,
like it's just to a degree. Obviously, it has to be done, but it's not acting in the national or the London interest from the government.
No.
In complete.
Not that I know anything about London. We've got some nice bridges up here.
Just to degrade the conversation slightly, it is a nice. I know it's breaking down and everything, but it is a nice looking bridge.
It's a beautiful bridge. I live really, really close to it. I used to walk over it every day. It's a beautiful
bridge, though.
I used to get the bus over it every day as well.
Yeah. So I know it's the big as the Humber. That's all I'm going to say. But yeah, it's
bridge
nice.
talk. This is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, we should probably move on from bridges. I don't think this is this is what people are here for.
That's the general point, is that basically the government is blaming London and devolved assemblies generally for things that just aren't their fault, and then withholding funding as a political move to get them to do things that are unpopular. Yeah. So that the Conservatives stand a better chance of winning in those devolved assemblies, which is so pathetic. And obviously the real people who suffer are the people who, the over 60s and the kids who used to get free London transport and now won't get it. Or the people who need to take the tube into work when TfL goes bankrupt.
Well, I learned something new about that with the Hammersmith Bridge, so I'm glad we spoke about that.
And you need to make the thumbnail for this just a picture of a bridge.
Okay, I don't make the thumbnail, so you'll have to raise that with Jack, but I'll mention it to him. Okay, shall we move on before we talk too much about bridges?
We talk too long.
Yeah, so there's a Telegraph article that was written about about Patrick Vallance speaking to MPs about the belief that once a vaccine's found, that this is all just going to be over. And I think that some people do kind of unrealistically put faith in the fact that once a vaccine's made, this is done, pandemic over, everything's back to how it was. We'll just talk about the pandemic as being, a relic of the past, something we all had to live through for a few months. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. What was said was basically that it's very rare that we'll get a vaccine that will be 100% effective. The only, I think he said, the only human disease that's truly been eradicated, this is a direct quote, the only human disease that's truly been eradicated, and that's from a highly effective vaccine, is to smallpox. So it's a very difficult thing to do. So although there's been a lot of progress on a vaccine, it's not going to be 100%. And I read a separate article as well that was basically just saying you have a percentage effectiveness of the vaccine. So assume that's 75%. It might not be, it might be higher, it might be lesser, but let's say that's 75%. Then you multiply that percentage by the percentage of the people that are given the vaccine. So again, among the over 60s or 65, I can't remember the exact age group, but they're given flu vaccines. And I think that's around 70 to 75% that have that vaccine. The over 60, I think the UK, is actually one of the leaders in the world in terms of the number of people who are given the flu vaccine. So assume that among the over 60s, that's 75%. You multiply those two percentages together and you get something, I don't know, 56%, something around there. So you multiply those two together. And 56% isn't that much. Like it isn't high enough to be able to relax social distancing completely. And that's assuming two very high percentages. That's assuming that the vaccine is 75% effective and 75% of people get it. I mean, the example I used was over 60, 65 because that's around the percentage that get them. But if you go in lower age groups, the percentage that people get the flu vaccine is lower. And I know that this isn't, coronavirus isn't the flu, but in terms of who you're going to immunise, how many people are going to accept, how many people are going to get the vaccine, it's not going to be a huge percentage because you can't force vaccines on people. And then there's the cost to it and everything else. So basically what they're saying is this, the main point of the story is that people are unduly putting faith in this vaccine, and it's not going to put the world back to how it was, unfortunately. We can all hope that we can get a 100% effective vaccine and it will be, we'll end this like we did smallpox, but the likelihood of that happening is not high. The likelihood of getting a vaccine is high, but the likelihood of getting a 100% effective vaccine is not. And I think people do need to bear that in mind, and I really hope that people don't think that when we do get this vaccine that's just going to be the silver bullet that's going to end this thing, because it isn't.
That's very cheery.
It's not. I know it's not. I know it's not cheery. I know it's not happy. I mean, I'll try and put more of a positive spin on it, which is that it will still do a lot to help the virus. That goes without saying. That a vaccine is obviously going to help massively, and social distancing guidelines will inevitably be relaxed as a result. They'll be, to some degree. They won't be completely. I don't think they'll be completely relaxed, but they'll be relaxed to an extent, and it'll be a lot easier to live life and everything else. So it is a positive. It's just not as much as of a positive as people seem to think. So yeah, has anybody else got anything to say about that? I think Nelson, you looked into this.
Yeah. So someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but none of the vaccines were in production produce a long-term immune response. It's all quite short. So it's invariably going to be a process of you have a vaccine, then a year later you have to have a booster vaccine. So it's going to be this cycle of restrictions easing and lifting as we vaccinate the entire population again and again and again.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's part of the whole. Assume that it's 75% efficient. I think that's where the efficiency, efficiency part comes in, because you'd love to be able to have a vaccine that you would give to someone and they'd be immunized, from then on, but it's not realistic. And then that's where the whole, vaccine rollout, arguments that have been going on at the minute come in, and how you distribute this vaccine to protect those most vulnerable, how often you get, how you get them there, how often you give people a vaccine if you do need it, every few months to be able to get this immunity. So it's just, it's a difficult one. As I say, none of us here, to my knowledge, have any higher education in anything to do with the sciences. So I'm sure that some of the terminology I used could be better. But from what I've understood from reading articles, that's what it seems like. I think immunity is probably the wrong word. I don't really know what the correct word is, but I think people know what I mean.
Short-term protection. Short-term
protection, yeah.
That is quite miserable, unfortunately.
It is.
I mean, it's good that you're informing the people. You're doing your duty, but it is still quite a miserable thing to think about for a little bit.
I really do want to stress that that's not to say it's not going to be good. And I know I've already said it, but I really want to make that clear, that I don't want people to go away from this thinking, well, to the vaccine, who cares, sort of thing, because it's still. It's still going to help, and it's still going to provide some form of protection against, a good protection, in fact, against the virus. It's just not 100%. So it's not this. As I said before, it's not the silver bullet. But
as time goes on, we better understand the virus, so we can put into place better measures. We've got to see the positive each and every day. We're understanding everything a bit better, and we can control it a bit better. It's just a matter of time before we eventually return to normality.
That's a good point. And as you say, so as we get the vaccine progress and as we get more knowledge of the virus generally, we'll be able to know about exactly how to deal with this best. And it's not so much guesswork, and it's more based on more accurate science, more well-researched and everything else, because we've got more data to deal with. So every day that goes on, we get closer to a vaccine, we get more information about it. So again, I'm just really trying to make this point that this isn't a negative, it's just managing expectations, and it's just being realistic about how this ends. But we'll have to see anyway. So should we move on to something else?
So Brexit, where to start? Last week, David Frost and Michel Barnier basically ended talks completely, saying that there was no deal in sight on the UK side, and the UK basically disinvited Michel Barnier from any future negotiation meetings, and Boris Johnson said to prepare for a no deal. The issue is that this week things have seemingly changed, in that Michel Barnier on Wednesday said a deal is within reach, and negotiations have restarted on a daily basis now. And apparently there are still 3 areas of dispute: fishing rights, level playing field, and dispute resolution. It's just a matter of time to see whether we can get a deal on these 3 key areas. But the talk in recent days has been more positive than it was last week.
Josh, any thoughts? I've noticed. I feel bad now that I scuppered your. We were going to talk about America.
No. I don't have a lot of knowledge on the whole Brexit, the ins and outs.
What about a layman's perception? What do you think then? You're the man on the Clapham omnibus.
I don't know. I think it feels like it was a negotiation tactic to say, from Boris, to just say it's all done. There's no point in negotiating. It feels like everyone wants a deal and they're working to it, and some form, to me at least, it feels like some form of deal will happen. Whether it means on those 3 issues that Nelson raised, only like 2 of them get sorted out or something. I think something will happen, and they'll just keep extending the deadline until the 1st of January, when that is the actual deadline. To me,
the deal would have to be concluded by mid-November.
Well, okay, mid-November, the actual deadline. I think something will happen before then.
Well, I've actually had this argument with another guy on TLDR. You all know Zach, other Zach?
Yeah.
Yep.
We occasionally have a little spat about it because he's very optimistic. He thinks that, well, I mean, so far his predictions have been wrong, but his end prediction might be right. He's always optimistic that this is all gamesmanship, and that there is a deal easily within reach, and everyone knows what's going on. I'm really quite pessimistic. I know that they've resumed talks, but I think that the deadline is just so much closer than people realise. Obviously, mid-November is really... Nelson, you probably know more about this than I do, but it really is like the actual last deadline, especially if the deal wants to get ratified by all those national assemblies in the EU.
Yes, so it has to be ratified by the European Council and then the European Parliament. So mid-November is the very last point at which it could do, unless an extraordinary summit is called and an extraordinary gathering of the European Parliament is called, because then we've got Christmas holidays, because invariably MEPs will go on holiday, so it has to be mid-November.
Does it have to go through all individual parliaments as well?
Yeah, it does. Well, it depends on the nature. If it cuts across competencies, it can be provisionally applied before it goes through all of them. But I think it has... I don't know how much that would do for us. Basically, the problem is that if the deal, like Canada's did, cuts past EU competencies, so, and I think some of the state aid stuff, like, the EU doesn't have sole jurisdiction over like the EU's state aid stuff. Yeah, for example, like some of that is still down to national assemblies, and so if
principle of subsidiary.
So if the deal says something about that, then they have to go check with every national assembly. Be like, "Is this okay with you? This okay with you? It's okay with you?" Which is there's 38 of them, quite a lot of them in the EU, so that'll take a while. But also, I think on the state aid and the dispute resolution thing, they are essentially, actually I should say the level playing field and the dispute resolution thing, which are the 2 last things, the 2 things apart from fishing that Nelson just mentioned. Those are essentially the same problem. The issue is about, which we explained in that video, the state aid thing, and I just don't see, I just don't see a way, a possible agreement on dispute resolution. And to make this very, very clear, very, very simply, obviously the UK says absolutely no, the European Court of Justice can't say anything about this, and the EU says we'll want to say, well, whatever deal we come up with, it's going to be about EU law, it's going to have to be the ECJ. And this would be fine if there was trust between the two sides. They could have some sort of fudge, like some sort of third party that, you know, sort of calls the shots and then in last resort refers cases back to the ECJ or whatever the UK's court is. But there was just too low a level of trust for them to agree on that sort of semi-fudge, I think. Anyway, that's why I'm generally pessimistic.
I completely agree, because ultimately there will have to be an external power that calls the final shots. It's not, because otherwise it's just going to be the UK and the EU shouting at each other. So the EU are going to stand firm and want the European Court of Justice, and then the only possible solution I could think is if the WTO court is involved in one way or another. But even though that's weak and the EU probably won't.
No, they will. I don't think they'll take that. I don't think the UK will take that. I think what would be more likely is that had this come up with a different government that had this come up pre the Internal Markets Bill, which is the bill where the UK suggested they break international law, I could have seen something equivalent to the Northern Irish Joint Committee. So it'd be a group of officials, half EU, half UK, and they talk it through, recommend some sort of dispute resolution, and if that isn't agreed on by both sides, then perhaps there are like retaliatory tariffs allowed or something like that. But I just think that at this point, the EU, that requires some trust. That requires some trust about the people you appoint to that committee. That requires some trust about whether or not you listen to the committee's decisions. That requires some trust about whether or not you decide not to just dissolve the committee, as they sort of have done with the Internal Markets Bill, once you've signed the deal. And I just think that the trust is too low there. It's a sort of semi-fudge, like it just sort of pushes the buck down the line a little bit to this joint committee, which is just reasonable officials. And I don't see either side trusting the other enough to go for something like that. I think that's a shame. So anyway, I currently put the odds of a deal about 40%, I think.
So that's the end of the podcast, and we're going to try and do these every week, so hopefully we'll have another episode just like this one out next Thursday. Thanks for listening.